Hey guys, Nicolette here with Insomnicat. Today, Bryan and I are talking to Michael Knight, president of TTI Semiconductor. And we're going to talk about what's in store for 2020 in terms of the industry. We're going to talk a little bit about AI, driving a robot, an electric vehicle, as well as some of the things that companies can do to really look at themselves and see how to handle disruption in the industry. So some really good stuff ahead. Listen in, you'll learn a lot. Hi guys, Nicolette here with Insomnicat. Today, Bryan and I are speaking with Michael Knight. Michael is the president of TTI Semiconductor, and he's here to talk about 2020 and what's ahead. Michael, thank you for joining us. And for those of us who don't know who you are, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and TTI?
Yeah, so, well, let me start at the beginning. I got into the electronic component industry back in the early 80s, actually in Silicon Valley, which was pretty neat because I got to see a lot of things that would later on become, quite famous, the birth of Apple Computer and things like that. And got to hang out with a lot of people who later on would become quite famous in the industry. So a great place to jump in. And I spent about half of my life in the industry working for component manufacturers, and the other half working for component distributors, jumping back and forth, largely in Silicon Valley until the late 90s. The last 15 years I've been working for TTI, and TTI has the notoriety of being the largest specialist IP&E distributor in the world. We're a part of Berkshire Hathaway. And I think we are, without a doubt, the best IP&E component solution in the business. And a few years ago, we developed a strategy to kind of to take that same concept, the TTI operating model, into the semiconductor world. And once upon a time, semiconductor distribution, there were a lot of specialists, guys like Memic and Insight, Wiley, really great companies that over time have disappeared as a result of M&A in the industry, to the point where really that option wasn't available to suppliers or customers anymore. So what we decided to do is put something together that looked and operated like TTI, with all of the resources of TTI and Berkshire Hathaway behind it, to bring that option back to the world, back to suppliers and customers both. And we're about 3 years, maybe getting close to 4 into the journey. Most of this has been initially driven through acquisition, and then we invest heavily in the companies that we're acquiring to get a really strong, better than market organic growth. And it's really something. Everything that I had hoped in terms of customer acceptance, supplier acceptance, has come to pass. And I have a second job, which is actually to build collaboration among all the TTI companies, especially as it pertains to the TTI Semiconductor group that I'm building and running. And that too has been coming along better than we could expect. We've got a ton to offer the customer world as well as the supplier world, and it's never a dull moment.
So Michael, we talked to you a few months back. We were talking about supply chain. We were talking about component shortages with the industry, and you were quite optimistic. And let's see, we're just about 11 days away from 2020. So we wanted to see what you were thinking in terms of the disruption that's coming, and in terms of innovation, and how can the industry really prepare itself for what's to come?
Yeah, and of course, as we come towards the end of the year, this is a hot topic for everybody. Everybody's in planning mode. Actually, most of the planning has been done, and now it's challenge mode, trying to understand what next year and maybe for the more ambitious, the year after looks like. And as you referenced, in my last conversation, I was very bullish about the future, especially the 2020s, and I remain so. There's nothing that's happened since we last talked that has has given me any cause for concern. TTI actually finished the year up, which, given how strong 2018 was for us, I think is quite an accomplishment. And we are projecting even better growth in 2020 across the family. So, and what's driving that? So let me back up. So talk a little bit. I'll talk for a second about disruption. There's a lot going on in the world, and you can probably sum it all up in terms of change and disruptive forces with one word, and it's digital. Digital, of course, is changing everything. I mean, look at what we're doing right now. Mm-hmm. That's a couple of years ago, we couldn't have done this like we're doing it. So digital is disrupting supply chains, it's disrupting relationships, it's disrupting how people go to market. And in disruption is opportunity. So part of the optimism you see coming from TTI, and it's not just from myself, it's the other presidents in the company, has to do with the fact that we think we are very well positioned to take advantage of some of the opportunities that always come with disruption. So we're doing things like we've got a lot of API links with customers. We're investing heavily there to do more of that. Starting to work on putting APIs in with suppliers. So trying to streamline and digitize our interaction for a lot of the basic blocking and tackling that we do, which is, quoting, inventory searches, that kind of thing. So that's, I think we're going to look back and think that's actually fairly crude, but it's an important first step. We're implementing robotic process automation pretty aggressively inside the company to streamline and speed things up. And all of this stuff becomes actually even more important given how difficult it is to attract talent these days for many of us. So there's a lot of stuff happening that all kind of starts with this word digital that is going to have very big, well, not gonna, already having a very big impact on the supply chain. So that only accelerates as we move into the 2020s and you have new applications coming online that are driving new technologies. There'll be new suppliers that come into the mix, old suppliers that we've grown up with that disappear either because they get acquired or miss a technology window. It's going to be pretty interesting. I'd say the 1990s have been extremely interesting, but honestly, I feel like we haven't seen anything yet with what we're looking at for the 2020s.
Is there anything that the industry as a whole should be, doing to prepare for this?
Yeah, the one skill set that we could all really benefit from sharpening up is crystal ball gazing, being predictive.
I was at the edge of my seat, Michael. I thought it was
Yeah, I was like, where's this going, Michael?
like, what is it? Tell me.
Yeah, you guys thought it was going to be something actually useful and implementable.
Hey, I guess if you could make that work, it'd be really useful, right?
But I do think it's a key to the future, and it's a really difficult thing to do. We are hardwired to be very good at extrapolating backwards, and it's very hard to extrapolate forwards because as you move forward, it's like a big decision tree and with these branches that multiply exponentially very quickly. So, the example I always use is if any of us can look at a smartphone today and think backwards 20 years or 30 years to when phones had a curly cord and they were attached to the wall. And you can see how we got from there to a smartphone today. And, in the process, there were PDAs that came and went and how all this got incorporated in the smartphone. It's actually a pretty easy path when you look backwards to understand. Now, if that was the case, though, then why weren't we able to look forward and see that? I mean, and the answer is obvious. What I see going forward from here is that things are happening much faster. There's greater integration, this whole digitization concept that I talked about, and it makes it even more difficult, but more important, because the pace that this new stuff is coming at us is faster and faster. What took 30 years to happen from a corded landline to a smartphone may only take 10 years. An equivalent of that might only take 10 years going forward. So that's why it's so important to have a really good idea of what's coming, because it is happening so fast that if we continue to do as an industry what I think our kind of our general industry business practice has been, which is try and react quickly. So, very much let's wait and see. And when it's obvious, we're going to react. That's going to be a very difficult thing to sustain, especially when it comes to the supply chain, because a lot of the things headed our way in the 2020s are even more massively component dense than what we experienced in the 1990s. And quite frankly, in my opinion, we're not even close to having the component manufacturing capacity that we need to support it. So from a component manufacturing standpoint, if we wait until it's very obvious that there's demand, and then you throw a year or two's lead time on to actually create that incremental capacity to support the demand, very disruptive for the industry. And we got a taste of that in 2018. That was the 2018 story. I think what we experienced in 2018 is a foreshadowing of things that we're going to experience repeatedly in the 2020s.
So one other thing that's not going anywhere in 2020 is 5G, and we're just kind of getting started. And recently you were talking about 5G on LinkedIn, and you were talking, there was a link you posted of how it would affect lead times and component availability. So, we started thinking about, what is the reality versus, what people might actually think about 5G and how it's coming, when it's coming, in terms of technology keeping up with it and components, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so 5G is it's a linchpin technology in that the ramifications of it are massive. And so as you correctly point out, it's the timeline, the implementation timeline, that is critical here. And this actually gets back to this whole topic of being predictive. The original predictions for the timeline were more aggressive than actually what's proven out so far. I think, looking at our business, talking to our customers, and we're, by the way, the TTI family is deeply involved with the entire infrastructure supply chain for 5G, from residential and commercial to mobile. And looking at all of that, I feel like we're probably a year and a half to 2 years off the original pace that people had predicted. Now, having said that, this year in particular, I've seen a lot of evidence of us starting to catch up. And I personally think 2020 is going to be the year it becomes very obvious to everyone that 5G is real. 5G is going to have a big impact on component demand. It's going to start to have an impact on lead times and product availability. That's not a universally held viewpoint at the moment. In fact, there's a lot of still people talking about whether 5G is for real and it's ever going to show up. I think all that goes away next year. There's think about it this way. When you look at the players in the industry, whether it's the communication suppliers, the Verizons and the AT&Ts and Sprints, et cetera, or the infrastructure providers, guys like Ericsson and Nokia, or all the many guys that are people making mobile phones, including Apple, when you look at what they're investing in 5G, and these are very smart people who in many ways are betting the future on the future of 5G. So to say that 5G is not really going to happen, or not going to happen as big as it's been predicted, is, to me, it seems kind of crazy. That means there's an awful lot of smart companies betting an awful lot of money on something that is going to be a misfire. So when you look at the data and that starting to float around, and you start looking at the use cases, and I've seen projections recently where they're saying 10 million 5G subscribers next year, growing to almost 2 billion in 5 years. And those seem to be pretty consistent numbers. In 5 years, 250 million or more subscribers here in the US. You think about all the work that has to happen between now and then to support that. To me, it's quite obvious that there's going to be an awful lot of equipment build out. It's starting now. It'll be a lot more obvious in 2020. I also think in the back half of the 2020, we're going to start to see the mobile phone industry really crank up to provide 5G mobile handsets. And that's going to be pretty interesting, because these handsets are very component dense. And one of the things that we've been contending with the industry the last few years is actually mobile phone production has been trending down. And I think we're going to flip that and have it start trending up, which is going to put even additional pressure on the entire supply chain as those devices soak up components. So 5G, in my mind, just the infrastructure handset piece of it is super compelling. But when the technology finally gets here and it's pervasive, you think about what it's going to enable in terms of Industry 4.0 and industrial IoT. When you think about what it'll enable in terms of when we get to autonomous driving, Intel is saying that an autonomous car in the future is going to generate as much as 4 terabytes of data per day.
Crazy.
You think about none of that happens actually without some new communication protocol like 5G. Low latency, very fast, high bandwidth, very dense data. So when that happens, I'm not even sure it's possible to predict all of the ways that's going to be deployed and how that's going to creep into our businesses and our lives, what that's going to do for edge computing, what that's going to do for server farms, what that's going to do for storage. As I started off saying, I think 5G is a linchpin for the 2020s. There's so much that gets built on it, all of which is going to use more and more electronic components.
So you talked about sort of, being able to, hopefully predict the future, right? Using the crystal ball, and a lot of companies, you bet on that. Do you believe that the companies, especially when we talk about like supply chain and, automation, right? And we just talked about autonomous vehicles, and the companies that are putting that, the research into it now and the development into it now, are those the ones that are really going to be ahead of the curve because they're preparing the process, they're preparing the instrumentation of the robotics, let's say, for warehousing or distribution or whatever delivery ahead of time? They're getting to that point so that way when 5G is really brought into the communication channel, that they'll have those the equipment and the machinery ready, whether it's an autonomous vehicle or it's robots picking and packing or whatever the case is.
Yeah, to varying degrees. So it's already happening now, but many companies are still trying to figure out how to implement and to take advantage of this. And everybody, because we are as a species kind of horrible at predicting the future, is moving at different rates, which means that in the first half of the 2020s, things are going to be real kind of herky-jerky.
Right.
As we all start to kind of sync up in terms of our view on the timing and the opportunity. But there's no doubt that what you're describing is already happening. And going to continue. And in my opinion, pick up momentum starting in next year.
So I started thinking, is there anything that's kind of undermentioned in terms of what to expect in 2020? You know, everybody's talking about kind of the same things. Is there anything that you're sitting back saying, why aren't more people talking about this? This is really what we should also be thinking about, you know?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question. Honestly, you know, based on the things that I'm following, I can't think of anything that's being under discussed or under reported on. There's so much, it's almost too noisy. I mean, we're talking about quantum computing and the AI effect, and you know, chat bots, and you know, on and on and on and on. It's very difficult to keep it all sorted out, and I think it's really one of the important things to do at this stage is understand the linkages, because some of these things are enablers of others, some of these things are accelerators of others, some of these things won't happen at all until something else happens. So if you can understand or figure out the timelines, the implementation timelines for each of these things, you can figure out the knock-on effect and start to get kind of a bigger picture view of what the world's going to look like, you know, next year, 5 years from now, and then translate that back into things that we all have to do in our businesses. And it's happening. So one, it's very wide, and two, it's getting very fast, which makes it very hard. And that's probably going to end up being, honestly, the most disruptive thing that we have to deal with. It's just, there's so much coming at us. You have your, you know, old mainstays like defense electronics, for instance. So defense electronics has been fabulous for the electronic component industry the last few years, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. You throw into that aerospace, which there's a lot of adjacency there. You know, plane build out, it's a little confusing right now because of the 737 MAX issues, but you know, there's no doubt that we're going to be building more and more planes. Satellites, which has been a big driver for us this year. One of my businesses is a company called RFMW, and some of their lead lines are Qorvo and Skyworks and Amplion. And we're having quite the run with the satellite guys, you know, folks like SpaceX and others who are putting up communication satellites in this rush to blanket the Earth in a network of very high speed, very low latency, low Earth orbit communication satellites that are going to open up the internet to that, you know, half the world's population today that doesn't have it. So you think about in 5 years from now, almost 8 billion people, all of them on the internet, and the infrastructure that it's going to take for that. So you roll that into the mix. So the short answer is, I think it's all out there. We just have to get used to drinking from a fire hose and see how much of it we can suck down and ingest.
It's interesting too, because besides, you know, if you think about AI, and we spoke about that a little bit, it's not just humans using the internet or doing research, it's the AI that we enable to go out and actually pull some of that information back too and bring it back to us. So it's not even just us. Sometimes we're sending out, you know, these little pieces of AI, this little piece of intelligence to go gather information and bring it back to us with research, you know, with commands.
Yeah, so. You're right, which just moves it along even further.
Right, exactly. And besides, I mean, forget about AI, then you look at robotics and things like that, and the data they're pulling in, it's pretty immense really quick.
Yeah, the one thing that I haven't touched on that is going to be an more important driver of the industry in the 2020s is just the electrification of transportation. So, you know, the obvious thing is cars, because that's all over the news. By the way, this is another one I'll say at this point, I find still some skepticism about this, you know, is the whole notion that one day electric vehicles are going to overtake internal combustion engine vehicles. There's a lot of people that don't believe that's going to happen. And my answer to that is similar to the one I gave earlier. Look at the big players in this industry, the GMs and the Fords and Volvos and Mercedes, and what they themselves are saying about their own plans for electric vehicle introduction. Anybody who doesn't think this is going to be the way vehicles of the future are powered, just is living under a rock.
Or in denial.
In denial. Yeah, big time.
They're afraid of the AI.
Yeah.
I remember one time reading like most people's real first true robotic experience, was a future prediction is going to be an autonomous vehicle. It's going to be driving in really an autonomous car. That's going to be your real first robotic interaction, not like your Roomba going around your house. Do you know what I mean? But where it's really interacting with the world. What's your thoughts on that with autonomous vehicles?
Yeah, I would agree with that in that I've long thought an autonomous vehicle is basically a robot with wheels. That's what it is. And that will likely be it. There may be a little bit of a race though, because the other place that robotics is going to show up in our lives at some point in a big way, I think comes in the healthcare industry. So first, AI is already getting more and more involved in diagnostics today. And a lot of times people have had an encounter with AI and they don't even realize that AI is at work behind the doctor that they're dealing with. Right. But we're going to start seeing more and more operations performed by robots. In fact, there is already hundreds of millions, I think, of operations that have been performed by robots, which is something that gets overlooked. But there'll be more of that. Another thing that 5G will help, because with zero or low latency, you'll be able to operate remotely. So you'll have a robotic operating station in a remote part of the world and a specialist who actually performs the operation from the other side of the world, kind of a thing. So I think we're going to see robots become more mainstream in our lives. I think it might time out kind of with when autonomous vehicles become more mainstream in our lives, which is what I'm talking about is like 5 to 10 years from now. It's not that far off.
Not that far away. Nope.
It's interesting too, because there's a lot of studies out there that are starting to show that AI is better at predicting some sort of, medical conditions or, than actually doctors are, with.
You could have my doctor who just Googles everything on the iPad anyway. So it's, I'm already being treated by a computer.
Yeah. So you look at the use cases for it in things like, I've just gone blank. I just went and saw this guy, my skin doctor. How can I not? Dermatology. Wow, that hurt. So that AIs for dermatology. We're just an approval away from there being an AI that all of us can access through our phone, and we can check ourselves every day if we want. If you're, let's say, you have prevalence towards skin cancer on your face, you can check your face every day. And these things are already as good, if not better, than very experienced board certified dermatologists. So that's pretty interesting in terms of and there's another whole trend in electronics, the med tech stuff, which is moving us away from what we call healthcare, but is really sick care. We don't actually start practicing medicine until something's really obvious and somebody's really sick. Right. Towards more of a healthcare where it's super preventative. And man, that's the world that technology is opening up for us, and that's really amazing. So that's another area where, is that robotics? It's not, I guess, robotics per se, but you're using an electronic device coupled with some AI and a cloud connection to do something that's pretty important to each of us personally.
I think it's funny when people are like, because there's a lot of people out there, like you were talking about earlier, that I don't know, well, you weren't saying they were afraid. I'm gonna say they're afraid of AI, right? They're afraid of some of these technologies, or they don't believe they exist. I just don't get, like, if you have an iPhone where you're unlocking it with your face, that is AI. It's pretty straightforward. You're
Yep. You talk to Alexa
yeah.
or OK Google or Siri, you're dealing with AI.
Well, Michael, one of the things we wanted to know was, what about TTI specifically? I mean, how are you guys preparing? You spoke a little bit about that in the beginning, but what's ahead for you as a company, and how you're dealing with the disruptive forces that are out there, specifically for TTI?
The first thing we're doing, it's going to sound like an odd answer, is learning to be really open-minded. This is a company that was founded in 1971. Has been highly successful. We're going to touch $6 billion this year. And, it's the old, if it works, don't break it, or however that saying goes.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Exactly. So we've got to resist that, and so we are learning to be open-minded, challenge our own assumptions, and starting to introduce things like, questions into our operations, like, why exactly do we do it that way? How does that bring value to our customers? Are we doing something for our customers or suppliers that we've always done that used to be important and now they don't care? How much of what we do that we think that makes us unique, that we think adds value to our stakeholders, actually is of diminishing value or maybe no value anymore to customers and suppliers. So trying to really look hard in the mirror, and then take that view and bounce it off of what we're hearing from customers, what we're hearing from suppliers, what we're reading, what we're experiencing, and create a situation where we're open to change. And it perhaps sounds very touchy-feely, overly simplistic, but honestly, I think it's really important for navigating all of this, because there's no way in the world we're going to see everything that's coming up. We are going to have to be able to react quickly, and we can't freeze in place, and we can't be in denial when we see something happening that's counter to our model. I mean, let's picture a future, maybe not that far from now, where the whole selling process looks completely different, where you don't have salespeople talking to customers, which gets pretty interesting, right? Because the chief role of a salesperson is to influence. Mm-hmm. Now, if on the customer side, a lot of the routine sourcing and purchasing is happening automatically through AIs and APIs, et cetera. Mm-hmm. What's a salesperson's opportunity to influence a computer decision? Zero.
Yep.
So these are the kinds of things that we're talking about, trying to figure out how to deal with it. You don't want to cut too early. There's plenty of examples of very forward-thinking companies who have jumped too fast, committed too hard too early. Mm-hmm. You also don't want to cut over too late. So that's what we're doing, and I think it's a winning formula. Not the most comfortable thing in the world to do, and it plays hell on planning systems, but I haven't figured out a better way to do it than that at this point.
It seems to be a common, I mean, what basically is happening as a business is comprised of humans, and as humans have to self-reflect, I mean, the business has to self-reflect, and I think it's pretty much what's happening a lot. I'm seeing, people looking internally, questioning what they're doing. So I think the very human side of the company, it's really nice to hear.
Yeah, it's over time, it's inevitable. It's going to change the complexion of the company. Who we hire, what skill sets we look for. but the overarching thing is, growth is awesome. Growth creates lots of opportunity for your employees. Without growth, things get very difficult. And maybe I should add to that profitable growth, because that, of course, is a challenge. And it's really weird when you think about this. Who was it? The guy from Fast Company or Wired that wrote Free. So that's about the whole free economy. And there is this kind of growing expectation, we all have it in our own online lives, that things are free. Mm-hmm. And that tends to push margins down, and it creates this mindset about pricing and all the rest of it that we're having to contend with. The net result, especially in the channel, is margins are very challenged. There's only one way that gross and net margins tend to go lately. And that's going to be a challenge. So I think it is important to couple that word profitable with that word growth. And if you can pull that off, you can do all kinds of great things for not only your customers and suppliers, but your employees as well. I mean, that's a winning formula. It creates a great environment. That's what we're after here. That's what we've always had, and it's our game plan is to maintain it.
That's great.
Bryan, am I forgetting anything? Is there anything else you wanted to talk to Michael about?
No, I think we hit it all. Michael, is there a place, if we wanted to find out more about what TTI is doing, the users could go and look it up? Yeah.
So there are two places. I mean, the first answer is probably pretty obvious. Our website. And, unfortunately, we've got multiple websites because we are a collection of companies, a family of companies. But then we have a website that it's a TTI Market Eye. So you can get to it off the main TTI homepage. And Market Eye is a site that we've been building and putting content on now for quite a while. And we've got a lot of third-party content that goes on there, but that's where we talk about what we're seeing going on in the industry. We provide a lot of stats. We provide a lot of analysis. We've got writers who contribute opinions on there. It's chock-a-block full of stuff about what's going on in our business. And I would highly encourage people to keep an eye on that.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming.
I appreciate the invitation. Good talking to you guys.